Coming up, a song that boasts one of the most iconic lines in the history of the rock era, written by an on-again, off-again folk rock duo whose troubled partnership produced some of the most endearing songs of all time. This instantly recognizable song, it's also the musical poster child of a classic film. This is a song that you're going to love more than you will know. Coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. I'll tell you what, if you want to be a part of a premier music community that curates the best of the rock and roll era, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and more, we do this through interviews, stories, and in-depth history. Subscribe below right now. Make sure to check the box and never miss out on our daily content. Also, you can check us out on Patreon where we give you extras. Your support helps us keep this a daily channel. Also, if you click up here, you can get Professor of Rock hoodie, our Professor Say 3 chords, and the Truth shirt. So I'm excited about today's program. It's another edition of our series, The New Standards. This is a show that we take an in-depth look into songs that really transcend genre, decade, and fads. Songs that are monumental touchstones in our culture and our society. This one has hypnotized every generation since its release. It is a catchy, yet deceptively deep 1968 movie headliner, talking about Mrs. Robinson by the great Simon and Garfunkel.
And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
Now, taking a step back to 1967, Simon and Garfunkel's manager, Mort Lewis, sensed that the duo was poised to break into the mainstream. Up to that point, they had appealed primarily to the younger college campus crowd. But Lewis had just received a phone call from Oscar-nominated director Mike Nichols, who wanted the pair to record some songs for his new movie, The Graduate.
I've come to talk with you again.
The film was actually almost finished at this point, but even with a fast-approaching deadline, this was undoubtedly a golden opportunity for one Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. Of course, we now know The Graduate as an essential entry into the annals of cinematic history.
Sage, rosemary, and thyme.
Of course, it's the coming-of-age story of recent college grad Benjamin Braddock, played amazingly by Dustin Hoffman. Ben returns home to California to a hero's welcome from his parents, but he's pessimistic about his future. At a homecoming celebration, Ben becomes reacquainted with Mrs. Robinson, the wife of his father's business partner.
I don't know what you want me to do.
Why don't you watch?
Oh, sure, thank you.
Mrs. Robinson is at that point, unhappily married and sees in Ben a welcome diversion. After manipulating him into driving her home, she attempts to seduce him. Startled and confused, Ben rejects her advances, yet his curiosity gets the better of him, and the two begin a recurring affair.
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. Aren't you?
Now, the story gets complicated when Ben is coerced by his parents to date Mrs. Robinson's daughter, Elaine. After some initial hesitation, he falls for her, and spurned, Mrs. Robinson threatens to reveal their tryst to Elaine. If you haven't seen it, I don't want to give too much more away, but really, the film was a cynical look at the prospects of the rising generation in the 60s.
Well, that's not saying much for my wife.
Point is, I don't love your wife, I love your daughters, sir.
At the time, it touched a nerve with audiences. The younger generation applauded the scrutiny leveled at themes of superficiality, consumerism, conformity, and alienation, really. Meanwhile, the older generation wasn't all that happy about the pot shots aimed at their values.
First this time.
I don't think we have much to say to each other.
It was a remarkable success, and it's still admired today. In 1998, the American Film Institute's 100 Years, 100 Movies, that list named it the 7th best film of all time. Like it or leave it, The Graduate has left a legacy that has resonated for generations. A legacy that Simon and Garfunkel definitely helped to jumpstart. However, when Nichols gave Paul Simon a copy of the novel by Charles Webb, Simon wasn't sold on it. He dismissed the story, saying, I didn't like anything about the film at first. I was only impressed with Mike Nichols, who asked us to do it. That seems to be the primary reason that Simon and Garfunkel agreed to the project at all. In 1971, Simon told the magazine Melody Maker, "We had nothing to lose and we didn't think that we had much to gain either. We weren't paid an enormous amount. We didn't think it was a big job. Dustin Hoffman was unknown at that point. Nichols initially didn't know very much about Simon and Garfunkel and thought that they were both songwriters. It wasn't until Nichols' brother introduced him to the albums Sounds of Silence and Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme during the film's production that Nichols took real notice."
The sound of silence going to Scarborough Fair.
When he did, he quickly fell under the spell of their songs and envisioned them as something that the main character, Ben Braddock, would really listen to. With that in mind, the goal was that Simon and Garfunkel would write an album full of new music for the film. Even though Simon and Garfunkel's music was a well-suited backdrop for The Graduate, the movie at that point was just about wrapped up. And there wasn't much time for Paul Simon, who was on tour at that point, to come up with new material. So while they waited, the production team actually played Scarborough Fair, The Sound of Silence, and April Come She Will in the picture, as placeholders. But as it turned out, they worked so well that Nichols opted to just keep them in.
Going to Scarborough Fair.
Now, as we get into this compelling narrative of the 60s classic, I want to recognize our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear, that helped to make this possible. The glasses that I'm always jamming on. And one of my favorite things about Zenni is that I've designed every single pair that I wear. Every one I own. And you can do the same thing. You can make them your very own. You pick the shape, the color, the style. You can add designs to the side like your kids' names or your business, your passion. I put Professor of Rock on the side. Check it out at Zenni.com today. You're going to like it. Now, at this time, putting old music in a new film was still a novel idea. Snippets from the previously written The Big Bright Green Pleasure Machine, satire and consumer culture, also made an appearance on the soundtrack. However, when Simon and Garfunkel presented two new songs for the film, called Overs and Punky's Dilemma, they actually didn't make the cut. Paul Simon did write another song, however, that Nichols not only accepted, but he fell head over heels in love with. Art Garfunkel mentioned to Nichols that they'd been working on a song called Mrs. Roosevelt, but the song had nothing to do with the movie's plot. Simon said it was a song about times past, about Mrs. Roosevelt and Joe DiMaggio and stuff. It was intended as a tribute, actually, to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and the passing of a more innocent era. Nichols took issue with the lyric Mrs. Roosevelt, and realizing it was the same number of syllables as Mrs. Robinson, Nichols said, "Don't be ridiculous. We're making a movie here. It's Mrs. Robinson." So with only a title set and a handful of lyrics, Nichols put the song into the film and a new standard was born.
God bless you, please, Mrs. Robinson.
The Graduate, it drew massive crowds and enthusiastic reviews. I mean, the combination of the music and the story, it was a tight fit. Clive Davis, the head of Columbia, he knew the film was going to be a sensation when he saw it. So he wanted Simon and Garfunkel to fill out the entire soundtrack. But with two songs already rejected and the film nearly finished, Paul Simon passed. Besides, he and Art didn't want people thinking that this was their new album. People were waiting for that. Ultimately, Davis conceded. He agreed to put their names in small print on the cover and not include any pictures of them. Instead, the provocative image of Mrs. Robinson's outstretched leg and Ben in the background filled the cover's visual real estate. It would be fair to say that consumer attentions were fixated on something other than Simon and Garfunkel. Despite the sparseness of new material, which only included two 1-minute, 12-second versions of Mrs. Robinson, The Graduate soundtrack shot straight to the top of the U.S. album charts. It hit number 4 a week after its release, which was a big deal back then. When it moved up to number 1, it stayed there for 9 weeks. In the UK, it peaked at number 3 and stayed in the charts for over 70 weeks.
All you see are sympathetic eyes.
The soundtrack surpassed 2 million in sales, and advanced orders for the forthcoming Bookends album, they began to stack up. Bookends was Simon and Garfunkel's 4th studio album. It's recorded between 66 and 68. Its first side is a concept album, or at least half of one. Moving from childhood to old age, it explores themes related to aging. Beginning with the Bookends theme, we travel along with the Save the Life of My Child, America, Overs, Voices of Old People, and finally Old Friends. Appropriately, the side closes with the Bookends theme once again.
They're all that's left you.
Side 2 is mostly made up of previously released singles and unused material for the Graduate soundtrack. Of course, this is where a completed full-length version of Mrs. Robinson would land.
Going to the candidates debate.
The time between release dates for the Graduate soundtrack and Bookends was only about 2.5 months. Graduate was still cresting at number 1 when Bookends entered the Billboard Pop chart. That was in April. It stayed there until Bookends replaced it on May 25th. But instead of cannibalizing each other's success, the two albums actually fed off one another. Between the two albums, Simon and Garfunkel had the number 1 LP in the US for an amazing 16 weeks. It's the Beatles territory, even beyond. There's no denying the appeal of Mrs. Robinson. It's just captivating. Music journalist Arthur Schmidt said that in Mrs. Robinson, Simon has composed perhaps the best song of the movie genre. It follows the plot, but explains it in imagery outside of the strict confines of that plot. And maybe that's where the secret of the song's success lies, in its ability to live both in and out of the movie at essentially the same time. As a child, when I listened to the lyrics, I always wondered what the character Mrs. Robinson had to do with the song at all. Candidate debates, pantries with cupcakes, Yankee immortal Joe DiMaggio. Part of the lyrical confusion seems to stem from the fact that the song's origins had nothing to do with the Graduate or Mrs. Robinson at all. I didn't know that at the time.
Put it in your pantry with your cupcakes.
The lyrics were directly pointed at Mrs. Roosevelt in an earlier era in American history. The resultant mesh between film and early 20th century America is an awkward but welcome musical hodgepodge. You can throw in Paul Simon's stream of conscience writing style on top of that, and you get a collection of loosely related motifs that are best understood from inside of Paul Simon's head, I suppose. However, the lyrics do blend to provoke some interesting thoughts. When you apply the lyrics meant for Mrs. Roosevelt to Mrs. Robinson, it really creates a narrative of personal loss instead of being nationalistic in scope. And the emotionally bulletproof seductress all of a sudden becomes vulnerable. I mean, hers is a loss of innocence over the course of an increasingly loveless marriage. Ben becomes a means to fill the void within her, and the cycle repeats as Ben loses his faith in the future and his innocence as well. That's what I love about it. Neither he nor Mrs. Robinson gained anything meaningful from one another, only temporary satisfaction and the bitter harvest of innocence lost. When Simon and Garfunkel sing Jesus Loves You More Than You Will Know,
Jesus loves you more than you will know.
and heaven holds a place for those who pray,
Robinson, heaven holds a place for those who pray.
to Mrs. Robinson, we as listeners recognize that her life isn't all that it should be. And whether you take this religious imagery straight up or tongue in cheek, it's clear that we are dealing with a musically disguised tragedy. As the song progresses, the scope of Mrs. Robinson's drama fades into the background, and a disillusioned nation comes into view. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. What's that you say, Mrs. Robinson? Joltin' Joe has left and gone away. My favorite ever. Ironically, Paul Simon was a bigger fan of Mickey Mantle than he was of DiMaggio. He had wanted to use Mickey's name, but rhythmically, it just wouldn't fit. If you try singing Where Have You Gone, Mickey Mantle, you can see why. It just doesn't flow. But thankfully, Joe DiMaggio does. Which I love it when Paul Simon explained this to Dick Cavett. He was asked by Cavett why he didn't use Mickey Mantle as an icon, of baby boomers and the times. And he said, and I quote, "It's all about syllables, Dick. It's about how many beats there are."
I had no idea that I would say that, but I said, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?"
And in reality, Joe DiMaggio did work for the messages a little better. Think about it. In 1970, June Southworth of Rave magazine said that these lines summed up the whole middle class, middle age of America, looking for its lost youth and the heroes like Joe DiMaggio who went with it. And this was Paul Simon's intent, to cast Joe DiMaggio as the long-lost hero of his song, perfectly capturing the loss of innocence that we've all felt as we fight against this dreary world. Interestingly, Joe DiMaggio took offense to the lyrics when he heard the song. As more of a straight shooter than a poet, he took the line to mean that he was no longer relevant. He was just a washed-up has-been. He even considered filing a lawsuit against Simon and Garfunkel, presuming that they had drug his good name through the mud, essentially. Now, years later, Paul Simon was dining at an Italian restaurant, and Joe DiMaggio also happened to be there, seated with some friends. Paul Simon had heard the rumor that DiMaggio was upset with the song. So Paul Simon got enough nerve to walk over and introduce himself, who was perfectly cordial and invited him to sit down with DiMaggio. Joe said, "What I don't understand is why you ask where I've gone. I just did a Mr. Coffee commercial. I'm a spokesman for the Bowery Savings Bank, and I haven't gone anywhere." Simon told him that he didn't mean the lines literally. Rather, he thought of Joe DiMaggio as an American hero and felt that genuine heroes were in short supply. A flattered DiMaggio accepted the explanation, and he thanked Paul Simon, and then they shook hands and said goodnight. That's a great story. When Joe DiMaggio died in 1999, Paul Simon wrote an op-ed speaking to the Yankee Clippers' larger-than-life status. Yes, he was a cultural icon, he said. A hero, if you will, but not of my generation. He belonged to my father's youth. In the 50s and 60s, it was fashionable to refer to baseball as a metaphor for America, and DiMaggio represented the values of that America, excellence and fulfillment of duty. He was the antithesis of the iconoclastic, mind-expanding, authority-defying 60s. The fact that the lines from Mrs. Robinson have been embraced over the years as a yearning for heroes and heroism speaks to the subconscious desires of the culture. We need heroes and we search for candidates to be anointed. Simon subsequently performed a subdued version of Mrs. Robinson at Yankee Stadium, DiMaggio's honor. It's one of the greatest moments out there where two cultural icons came together in truly haunting fashion. Baseball and music, Paul Simon and Joe DiMaggio.
A nation turns its lonely eyes to you.
Joe DiMaggio became the all-American hero that Paul Simon felt his generation was missing. And I think you could make an argument that heroes like that have been in short supply ever since. Everybody fell in love with Mrs. Robinson. It soared to the top of the U.S. charts, became Simon and Garfunkel's second number one hit. Mrs. Robinson also won 2 Grammy Awards. That was in 1969.
No secret, just the Robinsons are there.
Became the first rock song to win a Record of the Year and was also awarded Best Contemporary Pop Performance for a vocal duo or group. Simon and Garfunkel declined to perform the song live at that ceremony. Instead, they shot a video for the show set to the music that consisted of them romping around Yankee Stadium. a reference to the song's lyrics concerning DiMaggio. Mrs. Robinson has been covered a number of times throughout the years. A lot of notable performances. One of my favorites is Frank Sinatra. That was in '69.
And here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
The Lemonheads.
Mrs. Robinson, Jesus loves you more than you will know.
Bon Jovi did it in '96. Indigo Girls did it. And Garth Brooks did it just recently.
Mrs. Robinson, heaven holds a place for those who pray.
Mrs. Robinson has also appeared in a number of films and TV shows since The Graduate, 1967, including an extended parody of the ending of The Graduate, Wayne's World 2, that came out in '93. It's kind of where Gen X copped the song, their version of it.
Where's the First Presbyterian Church on Gordon Street?
There was also Forrest Gump in '94. American Pie in '99, Boston Public in 2001. Of course, rumor has it. And then Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that came out just a few years back. This was a song that my dad very concisely explained to me as a kid. I'll never forget it. It was a song that connected us fiercely due to the combination of music and baseball, the two things that we had in common through the highs and the lows of our relationship throughout the years. I've often thought about this song in not only the context of a shortage of heroes, but those heroes who sometimes let you down. And unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of that in the times that we live in. No one is perfect, but it's heartbreaking when we put our faith and belief in celebrities or sports figures, only to be seemingly disappointed when their character doesn't quite correlate with their legend. I mean, from the little boy's cry of "Say It Ain't So, Joe" in 1919, the Black Sox scandal, to the recent Me Too revelations, and on and on and on.
Say it ain't so, Joe. Say it ain't so.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about someone's failures or their imperfections, more their true character. That's why my hero will always be the person that introduced me to this song and explained it, my dad. I mean, sure, he had his imperfections. We all do, but he had integrity. He was a hard worker. He had compassion. He had conviction. And most of all, he had heart. He made changes from a very tough upbringing, and he made incredible sacrifices. So whenever I hear Mrs. Robinson now, I think of him, the hero that didn't let me down when it really counted. And maybe instead of mourning our hero's loss when we hear this song, we can take those lyrics of lost innocence and use them as a charge for us as individuals to step up and stand for integrity and conviction so that our children and our family, our posterity can say the same about us. Leave us a comment about Simon and Garfunkel and this irresistible, gotta sing along with it song. Tell us about your memories, your lost innocence, what it means to you. Really want to hear that or see that in the comments below. If you dig our content, make sure to subscribe below so you never miss out on any of our videos. We'd love to have you as part of our community, and Patreon as well, and merch. Just click up there. That really helps us to do the thing that we're here to do. Keep the music alive. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends. Talk soon.